On the afternoon of November 16, 1996, at approximately 2:45 p.m., Harold James Nicholson, a 46-year-old senior instructor at the Central Intelligence Agency's training facility in southeastern Virginia, walked through the security checkpoint at Dulles International Airport carrying a government-issued laptop computer and a single piece of luggage. He was scheduled to board a flight to Zurich, Switzerland, ostensibly for a CIA-approved personal trip. What Nicholson didn't know was that for the previous 5 months, a surveillance team from the FBI's Washington field office had been documenting his movements, monitoring his communications, and building a case that would eventually reveal one of the most damaging betrayals in American intelligence history. As he approached the departure gate, federal agents moved in, identified themselves, and placed him under arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. The laptop he carried contained classified documents detailing the identities of CIA officers he had recently trained. The trip to Switzerland had been a planned meeting with his Russian intelligence handlers, and the investigation that led to his arrest had uncovered evidence that for nearly 3 years, while serving as a branch chief and senior instructor responsible for training the next generation of CIA case officers, Harold James Nicholson had been systematically compromising American intelligence operations to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. The significance of Nicholson's betrayal extended far beyond the classified information he sold. He had been a deputy chief of station, a branch chief in the Counterterrorism Center, and most critically, an instructor and administrator at what CIA personnel referred to as the Farm, the agency's covert training facility where new case officers learned the tradecraft of espionage. In that capacity, he had direct access to the true names, cover identities, and operational training of dozens of newly minted CIA officers who would be deployed to sensitive positions around the world. Every trainee whose identity he compromised was potentially exposed to Russian surveillance, recruitment attempts, or worse. And every day he spent in that role, he represented the worst possible scenario for any intelligence organization, the insider threat, the trusted teacher who is actually working for the adversary. Harold James Nicholson was born in 1950 in Woodburn, Oregon, the son of a businessman and a homemaker in what appeared to be an unremarkable middle-class American family. His childhood provided no obvious indication of what would come. He attended local schools, participated in sports, and graduated from high school with decent grades and no particular distinction. In 1968, at the age of 18, he enrolled at Oregon State University, where he studied political science and international relations. It was during these college years, against the backdrop of Vietnam War protests and the cultural upheaval of the late 1960s and early 1970s, that Nicholson began to develop an interest in foreign affairs and government service. After graduating in 1972, Nicholson joined the United States Army. This was not an obvious choice for a young man with a college degree in that era, when many of his peers were actively avoiding military service. But Nicholson had developed a sense of purpose around serving his country, and he saw the military as a pathway to that service. He completed officer candidate school and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. His service was unremarkable but competent. He received standard evaluations, advanced through the normal promotion timeline, and completed various assignments without drawing particular attention to himself. The military provided Nicholson with structure, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself, and an introduction to the world of classified information and operational security. In 1980, Nicholson applied to the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was still operating under the shadow of the Church Committee investigations of the mid-1970s, which had exposed numerous illegal or questionable operations and led to increased oversight. The agency was rebuilding its operational capabilities and looking for candidates who combined military experience, education, and a demonstrated commitment to public service. Nicholson fit that profile. His military background, his degree in political science, his clean record, and his apparent dedication to serving American interests made him an attractive candidate. He passed the polygraph examinations, the background investigations, and the psychological evaluations that were standard parts of the CIA's vetting process. In early 1980, he was accepted into the career trainee program. The training that followed was intensive and comprehensive. New CIA case officers underwent months of instruction in everything from the technical aspects of espionage, dead, drops, brush passes, surveillance detection, secure communications, to the psychological dimensions of recruiting and handling foreign agents. They learned how to establish and maintain cover identities, how to assess potential recruits, how to elicit information without revealing their true purposes, and how to operate in hostile environments where discovery could mean imprisonment or death. Nicholson, according to his training evaluations, was a solid but not exceptional student. Upon completing his training in late 1980, Nicholson began his career as a CIA case officer. His first overseas assignment came in 1982 when he was posted to Manila, Philippines, under diplomatic cover. The Philippines in the early 1980s was a complicated intelligence environment. President Ferdinand Marcos maintained authoritarian control, but opposition was growing, and the communist New People's Army was conducting an active insurgency in rural areas. The country also served as a listening post for monitoring activities across Southeast Asia. Nicholson's job was to recruit and handle agents who could provide information on various intelligence targets of interest to the United States. Nicholson was effective in this role. He developed several productive agent relationships, filed regular intelligence reports that were well received by headquarters, and demonstrated the persistence and patience required for successful case officer work. He also, during this assignment, met and married a fellow CIA employee named Laurie. The couple had their first child, a son they named Nathan, in 1983. For the next several years, Nicholson's life followed the pattern typical of CIA officers: rotations between overseas assignments and headquarters positions, regular moves that disrupted family stability, the constant maintenance of cover stories and compartmented secrets, and the slow advancement through the agency's career ranks. In 1985, Nicholson was assigned to Tokyo, Japan, another critical intelligence post during the Cold War. Japan served as a crucial American ally in monitoring Soviet activities in the Pacific, and the CIA station there focused heavily on recruiting sources within the Japanese government, business community, and among Soviet officials posted to Tokyo. Nicholson spent 2 years in this assignment, continuing to build his reputation as a competent case officer. His superiors noted in his performance evaluations that he was reliable, professional, and capable of handling the complexities of case officer work in a sophisticated operating environment. But somewhere during these years, something changed in Harold James Nicholson's relationship with his employer and his country. The demands of CIA life were considerable. The constant moves disrupted family relationships. The pay, while decent, was far from lavish, particularly when compared to what experienced international professionals could earn in the private sector. The work required maintaining elaborate deceptions not just with foreign nationals, but sometimes with friends and family. And perhaps most significantly, Nicholson was watching colleagues receive promotions and choice assignments while he remained in the middle tier of the agency's operational workforce. Performance evaluations from the mid-1980s suggest that while Nicholson was consistently rated as satisfactory, He was not on the fast track to senior leadership positions. In 1987, Nicholson received what would prove to be one of his most significant assignments. He was posted to Bucharest, Romania, to serve in the CIA station there. Romania, under Nicolae Ceausescu, was one of the most repressive states in the Soviet bloc, with an extensive internal security apparatus that made intelligence operations extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. It was also, paradoxically, one of the few Warsaw Pact countries that maintained relatively independent relations with the West, creating opportunities for intelligence collection. Nicholson's assignment in Bucharest lasted until 1989, during which time he worked to recruit sources within the Romanian government and military while evading the surveillance of the Securitate, Ceausescu's notorious secret police. According to later testimony, it was during his time in Bucharest that Nicholson first began to seriously consider the possibility of working for foreign intelligence services. The specific motivations were complex. Financial pressures played a role. By the late 1980s, Nicholson and Laurie had 3 children, and the family was struggling with debt despite 2 CIA salaries. Professional frustration was another factor. Nicholson believed he deserved more recognition and advancement than he was receiving. But there was also, in his later statements, a component of ideological disillusionment with certain aspects of American foreign policy, though this claimed ideological element would be viewed skeptically by investigators who saw it primarily as rationalization for what was fundamentally a mercenary decision. The transformation of Harold James Nicholson from case officer to traitor did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It was, instead, a gradual process of boundary crossing, each step making the next one seem less impossible. What is documented with certainty is that in June 1994, while assigned to a liaison position in Malaysia, Nicholson made contact with Russian intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Russian embassy in Kuala Lumpur. The initial approach came from him rather than from the Russians, a walk-in in intelligence parlance, where a potential source voluntarily initiates contact. He was not seduced or manipulated into betrayal through elaborate recruitment tactics. He made a deliberate decision to sell classified information and then sought out buyers. The first meeting took place at a restaurant in Kuala Lumpur on June 29, 1994. Nicholson, using tradecraft he had learned and taught as a CIA officer, conducted surveillance detection routes before the meeting to ensure he wasn't being followed by American or Allied security services. He arrived at the meeting location with a small sample of classified information, nothing so significant that its compromise would be immediately noticed, but substantial enough to demonstrate his access and bona fides. The Russian intelligence officers he met with, 2 men operating under diplomatic cover, whose true names were never publicly revealed, listened to his proposal and asked careful questions designed to assess whether this was a genuine offer or some kind of American counterintelligence operation. The Russians had reason to be cautious. Walk-ins are simultaneously the most valuable and the most dangerous type of source. On one hand, they require no development time and often have already resolved the psychological barriers to betrayal. On the other hand, they may be provocations, double agents sent by hostile services to feed disinformation or to identify intelligence officers. The fact that Nicholson was a serving CIA officer with verifiable access made him potentially extremely valuable, but it also made the Russians suspicious that he might be a plant. They accepted his initial offering but did not immediately commit to an ongoing relationship. Instead, they told him they would need time to verify what he provided and to consider his proposal. Over the following weeks, the Russians conducted their own investigation of Harold Nicholson. They checked the information he had provided against other sources they controlled. They likely consulted with SVR headquarters in Moscow about how to proceed, and they assessed the risks and potential rewards of establishing a relationship with someone in his position. By late July 1994, they had made their decision. They would accept Nicholson as a source. At a second meeting, they provided him with instructions for future communications, established a payment schedule, and began formally tasking him for specific information. The financial arrangements were straightforward. The Russians agreed to pay Nicholson between $20,000 and $30,000 for each significant delivery of classified information. This was not the massive sums that have characterized some espionage cases, but for Nicholson, facing mounting family debts and feeling undervalued by his employer, it represented significant money. More importantly, perhaps, it represented validation. The Russians were willing to pay him for what he knew, treating him as valuable in a way he felt the CIA did not. What Nicholson provided to his Russian handlers during the summer and fall of 1994 was primarily information related to CIA operations in the region where he was assigned. He delivered intelligence reports, operational cables, and information about CIA activities and personnel in Southeast Asia. The damage from these initial compromises was real but limited in scope. That would change in December 1994 when Nicholson received orders for a new assignment that would dramatically increase his access. In December 1994, Harold Nicholson was reassigned from his position in Malaysia to a role at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The new assignment was to the Counterterrorism Center, where he would serve as branch chief for a component focused on terrorism threats in Europe and the Middle East. This was a significant promotion, reflecting the agency's continued confidence in Nicholson. The Counterterrorism Center had been established in 1986 in response to growing threats from terrorist organizations, and by the mid-1990s it had become one of the most critical operational components within the CIA. Branch chiefs in the center had access to sensitive intelligence from multiple sources, operational plans for countering terrorist threats, and information about liaison relationships with foreign intelligence services. For someone engaged in espionage against the United States, this assignment offered access to an extraordinary range of classified information. Nicholson now had reason to review intelligence reports from across the CIA's global network of stations, to participate in planning meetings where sensitive operations were discussed, and to see personnel assignments and operational deployments. He began systematically collecting classified materials that he believed would be of interest to his handlers, downloading files onto portable media, making copies of documents, and memorizing details that couldn't be easily removed from secure facilities. The logistics of passing this information to the Russians became more complicated now that Nicholson was based in the United States rather than overseas. Meeting with Russian intelligence officers in the U.S. carried significantly greater risk of detection by American counterintelligence. The solution was to establish a pattern of meetings in third countries during Nicholson's foreign travel. Throughout 1995, Nicholson traveled overseas several times on legitimate CIA business. During these trips, he would add personal days to his itinerary and arrange meetings with his Russian handlers in various cities. Bangkok, Thailand, became a favored location, as did Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. The meetings typically followed a similar pattern. Nicholson would arrive at a predetermined location, conduct surveillance detection to ensure he wasn't being followed, make contact with his Russian handlers, deliver whatever classified materials he had brought, receive payment and new tasking, and then return to his hotel and continue with his legitimate travel schedule. During 1995, Nicholson provided the Russians with extensive information about CIA counterterrorism operations, information about agency liaison relationships with foreign services, and details about CIA's understanding of Russian intelligence operations. But the most significant aspect of his betrayal was still to come. In July 1995, Nicholson was transferred from the Counterterrorism Center to a position at the CIA's primary training facility for operations officers, officially known as Camp Peary, located on approximately 9,000 acres of land near Williamsburg, Virginia. The facility, operated by the CIA but officially designated as a Department of Defense installation, served as the location where newly hired case officers underwent the final phase of their training before being certified for operational assignments. The training at Camp Peary was intensive, comprehensive, and highly classified. Trainees learned advanced tradecraft, conducted realistic exercises, simulating operational scenarios, and were evaluated on their ability to perform under pressure. Nicholson's position was not as an instructor for the basic tradecraft courses. Instead, he was assigned as the deputy chief of the counterintelligence training branch and later as chief of a branch responsible for internal operations at the training facility. These administrative and supervisory roles gave him broad access to information about trainees, their true names, their cover names, their backgrounds, their strengths and weaknesses as assessed by instructors, and their planned first assignments after completion of training. He had access to files containing photographs, personal history statements, psychological evaluations, and the entire paper trail that documented each trainee's journey through the agency's security clearance and training process. For Russian intelligence, this information was extraordinarily valuable. First, knowing the true identities of newly trained CIA officers meant that Russian counterintelligence could begin tracking these individuals from the beginning of their careers. When a new case officer showed up at an embassy or consulate under diplomatic cover, the Russians would potentially already know their true identity. Second, understanding how the CIA trained its officers provided insights into American operational methods and priorities. Third, knowing who the newest generation of CIA case officers were created opportunities for the Russians to attempt to recruit or compromise them early in their careers. Nicholson began systematically photographing trainee rosters, class photographs, and biographical files using a small camera he concealed in his briefcase. He memorized details from classified training materials. He noted which trainees were identified as having particular language skills or regional expertise that might indicate their likely first assignments. And then, during his trips overseas to meet with Russian handlers, he delivered all of this information in exchange for cash payments that were deposited into bank accounts he controlled. In his role at the training facility, Nicholson was responsible for helping to prepare new case officers to protect themselves from recruitment by foreign intelligence services, and simultaneously he was compromising the very officers he was supposed to be helping to protect. Every class photograph he provided to the Russians represented a group of Americans whose safety and effectiveness were being undermined by someone they believed was on their side. The investigation that would ultimately lead to Harold James Nicholson's arrest began not with any dramatic discovery, but with routine financial monitoring and an accumulation of small anomalies that, viewed individually, might mean nothing, but together suggested a pattern that demanded attention. In the spring of 1995, as part of ongoing security procedures, CIA personnel security officers were conducting periodic reviews of agency employees' financial records. This was standard practice, particularly for officers with access to sensitive compartmented information. The purpose was to identify employees who might be experiencing financial difficulties that could make them vulnerable to recruitment, or who might be living beyond their means in ways that could indicate they were receiving money from unauthorized sources. During one such review, an analyst noticed that Harold Nicholson had made several large cash deposits to his bank accounts over the previous months, deposits that seemed inconsistent with his CIA salary. The amounts involved were not enormous, typically between $5,000 and $12,000 per deposit, but they were significant enough to warrant questions. When asked about these deposits during a routine security update interview, Nicholson provided explanations that were plausible but somewhat vague. Gifts from relatives, proceeds from selling personal property, reimbursements from friends for shared expenses. None of these explanations could be immediately disproven, but they also couldn't be easily verified. The security officer who conducted the interview noted the responses in Nicholson's file and flagged the matter for follow-up review. Over the following months, additional anomalies emerged. In July 1995, during a routine polygraph examination, Nicholson showed unusual physiological responses to questions about unauthorized contacts with foreign nationals and about potential security violations. The polygrapher noted these responses in the examination report, but concluded that they were not sufficiently definitive to indicate deception. But combined with the earlier financial anomalies, the polygraph results added another data point to a slowly accumulating file. In September 1995, another piece of information came to the attention of CIA counterintelligence officers. A routine review of travel records showed that Nicholson had taken several overseas trips, during which he had extended his stay beyond what was required for his official business, using personal leave days to remain in cities like Bangkok and Singapore. This was not inherently suspicious, but the pattern of these extensions, combined with the financial anomalies and the ambiguous polygraph results, began to form a picture that concerned counterintelligence professionals. The formal investigation of Harold James Nicholson began in late 1995, when the various anomalies and concerns were aggregated and reviewed by a team of analysts in the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. The decision to open an investigation was not made lightly. Investigating a serving CIA officer, particularly one with Nicholson's experience and access, required approval from senior leadership and had to be carefully controlled. If Nicholson was indeed engaged in espionage, alerting him to the investigation would allow him to destroy evidence, cease his activities, or even flee. If he was innocent, conducting an investigation could irreparably damage his career and reputation. The initial phase of the investigation focused on discreet inquiries that would not alert Nicholson to the scrutiny he was under. Investigators reviewed his financial records in detail, examining bank statements, credit card transactions, mortgage payments, and tax returns. They conducted discreet interviews with colleagues who had worked with him, framed as routine reference checks. They analyzed his travel patterns, looking for anomalies or patterns that might indicate clandestine meetings. And they began the process of reviewing classified materials he had accessed to determine what information he potentially could have compromised. By early 1996, the investigation had developed enough information to warrant more aggressive measures. Financial analysis showed that Nicholson had received significant unexplained income over the previous 18 months. His travel patterns showed repeated visits to cities that were known operational environments for Russian intelligence services. And a detailed review of his work computer revealed that he had accessed and downloaded numerous classified files that were not directly related to his official responsibilities. In May 1996, the FBI formally joined the investigation. Under U.S. law, espionage, investigations within the United States fall under the FBI's jurisdiction. A joint CIA-FBI task force was established, operating out of secure spaces at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The task force was kept small to maintain operational security. Fewer than a dozen investigators and analysts knew the full scope of the investigation. Their mission was to determine definitively whether Harold Nicholson was engaged in espionage, to identify what information he had compromised, and to gather evidence that could be used in a criminal prosecution. The investigation strategy involved multiple parallel tracks. First, investigators would conduct intensive financial surveillance, tracking every deposit, withdrawal, and transaction in Nicholson's accounts. Second, they would establish physical surveillance of Nicholson himself, monitoring his movements, contacts, and communications. Third, they would attempt to catch him in the act of passing classified information to foreign handlers. And fourth, they would search for evidence of espionage in his home, office, and electronic communications. The physical surveillance operation began in earnest in June 1996. FBI special agents trained in surveillance techniques began following Nicholson during his daily routine. They documented his commute to and from the training facility, observed his meetings and interactions, noted his habits and patterns. The surveillance was sophisticated and careful, rotating different agents and vehicles to avoid detection, using electronic tracking devices when legal authority could be obtained, maintaining constant but invisible observation. Nicholson, despite all his training, apparently never realized he was being watched. During these weeks of surveillance, investigators observed Nicholson engaging in activities that heightened their suspicions. On several occasions, he was seen conducting what appeared to be surveillance detection routes, taking circuitous paths to destinations, making sudden changes in direction, entering buildings through one entrance and exiting through another. For someone engaged in normal daily activities, such behavior would be unnecessary. For someone preparing to meet with foreign intelligence handlers, it would be standard procedure. The breakthrough in the investigation came in late October 1996. Investigators had obtained legal authorization to search Nicholson's government-issued laptop computer, which he routinely took home with him, despite regulations requiring classified material to remain in secure facilities. On the evening of October 31st, while Nicholson was out of his residence, FBI agents entered his home and conducted a covert search. What they found on the laptop provided the evidence they needed: classified documents relating to CIA personnel, operations, and methods that Nicholson had downloaded and stored on the portable computer. Further analysis of the laptop revealed something even more damning: evidence that files had been deleted but were still recoverable from the hard drive's unused sectors. Computer forensics specialists recovered these deleted files and found hundreds of pages of classified material, including photographs of CIA training rosters, biographical files of new case officers, operational cables, and intelligence reports. The pattern was clear. Nicholson was systematically collecting classified information, storing it on his laptop, and then deleting it after presumably transferring it elsewhere. Armed with this evidence, investigators now shifted their focus to catching Nicholson in the act. They had proof that he was stealing classified material, but they wanted to document the full extent of his betrayal and, if possible, identify his foreign contacts. The opportunity came when investigators learned that Nicholson had scheduled a trip to Switzerland in mid-November, ostensibly for personal reasons. Switzerland was a neutral country with a long history as a venue for intelligence meetings. The timing of the trip, coming just days after he had accessed numerous classified files, suggested to investigators that this might be a planned meeting with his handlers. The decision to arrest Harold James Nicholson rather than continue the surveillance was made after intensive deliberation among senior officials at the FBI, CIA, and Department of Justice. The argument for letting him make the trip was that it would provide an opportunity to identify his Russian handlers and potentially to catch him in the act. The argument against allowing the trip was that it would give him an opportunity to deliver whatever information he had collected, potentially causing further damage, and that there was a risk he might detect the surveillance and flee. The decision to arrest Nicholson before he could board his flight was driven by several factors. First, the evidence already gathered was judged sufficient to obtain a conviction. Second, allowing him to travel overseas carried unacceptable risks. Third, every additional day that Nicholson remained in his position potentially gave him access to more classified information that could be compromised. On November 16, 1996, at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, as Harold Nicholson walked through Dulles International Airport toward his departure gate, the FBI surveillance team that had been monitoring him since early that morning radioed confirmation that he had cleared security and was proceeding to the gate for his flight to Zurich. The arrest team, composed of FBI special agents who had been positioned throughout the terminal, began moving into position. The operation was carefully coordinated to minimize the possibility of a scene that would attract attention from other travelers. As Nicholson approached the departure gate, two FBI agents approached him from opposite directions. They were dressed in business attire and carried credentials, identifying them as federal law enforcement officers. Approximately 2:47 p.m., they made contact with Nicholson, identified themselves, and requested that he accompany them to a secure location within the airport. Nicholson, according to later reports, showed no particular surprise or resistance. He complied with the agent's instructions and was escorted to an airport security office that had been cleared for this purpose. Once in the secure office, agents formally placed Nicholson under arrest and read him his Miranda rights. The initial charges were conspiracy to commit espionage and attempted espionage. Agents seized the laptop computer he had been carrying, his luggage, and personal items, including his passport and wallet. A preliminary search of his luggage revealed additional classified documents that Nicholson had been carrying with him. Documents relating to CIA operations that he had no legitimate reason to be transporting to Switzerland. Nicholson was then transported to the FBI's Washington field office, where he was placed in a holding cell while investigators prepared for a formal interrogation. The arrest had been timed to occur on a Saturday afternoon, giving investigators the weekend to conduct initial interrogations before Nicholson would have to be brought before a magistrate judge. During this time, a parallel team of FBI agents executed search warrants at Nicholson's residence in Burke, Virginia, and at his office at the training facility. The search of Nicholson's home, conducted throughout the evening of November 16th and into the early morning hours of November 17th, yielded extensive evidence of his espionage activities. Investigators found classified documents hidden in various locations throughout the house, in a locked filing cabinet, in boxes in the attic, tucked into books on shelves. They found multiple computer disks containing classified files. They found notes in Nicholson's handwriting listing information he had accessed and apparently intended to provide to his handlers. And they found financial records documenting substantial deposits that could not be explained by legitimate sources of income. Perhaps most significantly, investigators found communications and travel records that established a pattern of meetings with Russian intelligence officers. Among the materials seized were calendar notations that corresponded to dates when Nicholson had traveled overseas, notations that used what appeared to be code words or abbreviations to denote meetings. There were receipts from hotels and restaurants in cities where the meetings had allegedly occurred. And there were notes containing what appeared to be instructions for future meetings, including specific locations, dates, and recognition signals. The interrogation of Harold Nicholson began on the evening of November 16th and continued intermittently over the following 48 hours. The interrogation team was led by experienced FBI counterintelligence agents who specialized in espionage cases. Their approach was methodical and informed by the extensive evidence that had already been gathered. They did not need Nicholson to confess in order to prosecute him. The physical evidence was substantial. But they needed his cooperation to conduct a full damage assessment, to understand what specific information had been compromised, and to identify any other individuals who might be involved. The initial interrogation sessions followed a pattern that investigators had refined over years of conducting such interviews. The agents began by establishing a non-threatening rapport, speaking to Nicholson in professional tones and treating him with the respect due to someone who had served as a case officer. They presented him with some of the evidence they had gathered, demonstrating that they already knew a significant amount about his activities, and they offered him an opportunity to explain his actions and to cooperate with the investigation. Nicholson's response during these first interrogation sessions was guarded and calculating. He acknowledged that he had taken classified documents home on his laptop, but characterized this as a violation of security procedures rather than espionage. He claimed that he had intended to review the materials for work-related purposes and had simply failed to follow proper protocols. When confronted with evidence of his meetings with Russian intelligence officers, he initially denied that such meetings had occurred, suggesting that the evidence was being misinterpreted. As the interrogation continued, and agents presented increasingly detailed evidence, including specific dates, locations, and descriptions of meetings that could only have come from intensive surveillance, Nicholson's denials became less tenable. On November 18th, after consulting with an attorney, Nicholson indicated that he was willing to make a statement. What followed was a partial confession that would provide the foundation for the criminal case against him. According to the statement Nicholson provided, he had first made contact with Russian intelligence officers in June 1994, while assigned to Malaysia. He acknowledged that he had voluntarily approached the Russians and offered to provide classified information in exchange for payment. He confirmed that he had met with Russian handlers on multiple occasions over the following 2.5 years, during trips to various overseas locations. He admitted to providing the Russians with classified documents, information about CIA operations and personnel, and details about training procedures and new case officers. What Nicholson did not provide, however, was a complete accounting of everything he had compromised. He minimized the significance of the information he had passed, claiming that much of it was routine or low-level material. He declined to provide specific details about his Russian handlers, saying he knew them only by pseudonyms, and he maintained that he had acted alone, without the knowledge or assistance of any other CIA employees or American citizens. This partial confession created a significant challenge for investigators and prosecutors. Nicholson's admission that he had engaged in espionage provided the basis for criminal charges. But his refusal to provide full cooperation meant that a comprehensive damage assessment would require investigators to reconstruct his activities through other means. Every file he had accessed, every trainee whose information he had viewed, every operation he had knowledge of had to be reviewed to determine what might have been compromised. Harold James Nicholson made his first appearance in federal court on November 19, 1996, before U.S. Magistrate Judge W. Curtis Sewell in Alexandria, Virginia. The courtroom was closed to the public and the media due to the classified nature of the case. Nicholson appeared without shackles, but under the close supervision of U.S. Marshals, his attorney, a public defender who had been assigned, to represent him pending his retention of private counsel, stood beside him as the charges were formally read. The initial complaint charged Nicholson with conspiracy to commit espionage, a violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 794. This was one of the most serious charges in federal criminal law, carrying a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. The complaint outlined in general terms the government's allegations that between June 1994 and November 1996, Nicholson had conspired with agents of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service to communicate classified information relating to the national defense of the United States. Judge Sewell ordered Nicholson detained without bond, finding that he posed both a flight risk and a danger to national security. The flight risk was obvious. Nicholson had been arrested while attempting to travel overseas. He had access to Russian intelligence contacts who might assist him in fleeing, and if convicted, he faced a potential life sentence. The national security risk was equally clear. As a trained intelligence officer with extensive knowledge of classified operations and personnel, Nicholson could potentially cause further damage if released. Over the following months, as the case moved through the legal system, federal prosecutors and Nicholson's attorneys, he had by this time retained Jonathan Shapiro, an experienced criminal defense lawyer, engaged in extensive negotiations. The government's evidence was overwhelming. The classified documents found on Nicholson's laptop and in his home, the financial records showing unexplained income, the surveillance documentation, and his own partial confession made conviction virtually certain. The question was not whether Nicholson would be found guilty, but rather what sentence he would receive and what level of cooperation he would provide. On March 3, 1997, Harold James Nicholson appeared in federal court and entered a guilty plea to one count of conspiracy to commit espionage. As part of the plea agreement, he agreed to cooperate with government investigators in conducting a damage assessment and to submit to polygraph examinations to verify the truthfulness of his statements. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence at the lower end of the applicable guideline range and not to seek the death penalty. The guilty plea hearing provided the first public disclosure of the details of Nicholson's betrayal. In a statement to the court, Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Chestnut outlined the scope of Nicholson's espionage activities. According to Chestnut's proffer, Nicholson had received approximately $300,000 from Russian intelligence services over the 2.5 years of his activities. He had provided the Russians with classified information that compromised more than 100 intelligence operations and exposed the identities of numerous CIA case officers, including virtually every member of his class at the training facility during the period when he served there. Chestnut described how Nicholson had systematically photographed training rosters, class photographs, and biographical files of new case officers, providing the Russians with a comprehensive database of the newest generation of CIA operatives. He explained how Nicholson had used his position to access information about CIA operations around the world, including details about liaison relationships with foreign intelligence services, operational methods and capabilities, and specific intelligence collection priorities. And he detailed the meetings Nicholson had conducted with Russian intelligence officers in Bangkok, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and other locations. The damage assessment that the CIA and FBI conducted in the months following Nicholson's arrest revealed the full extent of the compromise. More than 100 CIA case officers who had been trained during the period when Nicholson had access to training facility records were potentially exposed to Russian intelligence. Some of these officers had already been deployed to overseas stations under cover. Their identities were now known to the Russians, making them targets for surveillance and potential recruitment or harassment. Others were still in training or awaiting their first assignments. Their careers were effectively compromised before they had even begun operational work. The operational compromises extended beyond personnel. Nicholson had provided information about CIA's technical capabilities, including details about surveillance equipment, secure communications systems, and methods for conducting operations in denied areas. He had revealed information about CIA's understanding of Russian intelligence operations, potentially allowing the Russians to identify sources or methods that had been providing information about their activities, and he had compromised specific operations in the counterterrorism arena. The human cost of Nicholson's betrayal was difficult to fully quantify but clearly substantial. At least one CIA source in Russia, whose identity may have been compromised through information Nicholson provided, disappeared and was presumed to have been arrested or killed. Numerous operations had to be canceled or redesigned after Nicholson's arrest, resulting in the loss of intelligence collection opportunities that had taken years to develop. And dozens of CIA officers faced the knowledge that their identities and training had been compromised by someone they had trusted. Sentencing in the case occurred on June 5, 1997, again before a closed courtroom in Alexandria. Judge Claude Hilton, who presided over the sentencing, heard testimony from government witnesses about the damage Nicholson had caused and from defense witnesses who spoke to Nicholson's character and background. Nicholson himself made a brief statement to the court, expressing remorse for his actions and claiming that he had never intended to harm individual CIA officers, only to obtain money to support his family. Judge Hilton rejected this characterization. In his remarks from the bench, the judge noted that Nicholson was a trained intelligence officer who fully understood the consequences of his betrayal. He had not acted out of ideology or under coercion, but purely for financial gain, and he had specifically compromised the identities of individual CIA officers, many of whom were young people just beginning their careers, exposing them to potential danger for his own profit. The judge characterized these actions as a betrayal of the highest order and noted that Nicholson had violated every oath he had taken. The sentence Judge Hilton imposed reflected the severity of the crimes: 23 years and 7 months in federal prison, which at the time was one of the longest sentences ever given in a peacetime espionage case. The sentence was calculated to ensure that Nicholson would serve substantial time. The federal parole system had been abolished for crimes committed after 1987, meaning Nicholson would be required to serve at least 85% of the sentence before becoming eligible for release. Following sentencing, Nicholson was transferred to the federal prison system to begin serving his sentence. He was initially housed at a high-security facility where inmates convicted of espionage and other national security crimes were typically held. The conditions were restrictive: limited contact with other inmates due to security concerns, extensive monitoring of communications and visitors, and isolation from the general prison population. The most immediate impact was on Nicholson's family. His wife, Laurie, who worked for the CIA and had been married to Nicholson throughout the period of his espionage activities, was subjected to intensive investigation to determine whether she had any knowledge of or involvement in his betrayal. The investigation concluded that she had been unaware of her husband's espionage, making her another victim of his actions rather than a co-conspirator. She divorced Nicholson shortly after his conviction and left the CIA, facing the reality that her marriage had been built on deception and that her career in intelligence was effectively over. Nicholson's children, Nathan, Jeremy, and Starr, faced an even more devastating impact. At the time of their father's arrest, they ranged in age from 13 to 8 years old. They were told initially that their father had been arrested for security violations related to his work, a deliberately vague explanation designed to protect them from the full truth. As they grew older and became capable of understanding the reality of what their father had done, they were confronted with impossible questions about loyalty, love, and identity. The children maintained contact with Nicholson through prison visits and correspondence. In his letters to them, according to later court documents, Nicholson expressed remorse for the impact his actions had on their lives. He told them he had made terrible mistakes, driven by financial pressures and poor judgment. He claimed to love them and to regret that his choices had deprived them of a father during their formative years. But he also, in ways that would later prove significant, maintained that he had been acting in what he believed were their best interests. In the years following his imprisonment, Nicholson settled into the routine of prison life. He worked prison jobs, participated in educational programs, and maintained what prison officials described as good behavior. He took advantage of opportunities to communicate with his children through the prison's controlled correspondence system. And he began to plan for his eventual release, calculating that with good time credits, he could be released in his mid-60s and potentially have years remaining to rebuild some relationship with his children. But in 2008, more than a decade after his initial arrest, federal investigators received information that shattered any assumptions about Nicholson's reformation or genuine remorse. A source reported that Nicholson, while imprisoned, had found a way to continue his espionage activities through the assistance of his eldest son, Nathan. The investigation that followed revealed a scheme that was both ingenious and deeply disturbing. According to prosecutors, Nicholson had used his prison correspondence with Nathan, who was by this time in his mid-20s, to convey messages to his former Russian intelligence handlers. The communications were carefully crafted to avoid detection by prison censors. Nicholson would include in his letters to Nathan what appeared to be innocuous comments or instructions, suggestions about travel destinations Nathan might enjoy, recommendations for books or films, discussions of financial matters that actually contained coded instructions for contacting Russian intelligence and arranging meetings. Nathan Nicholson allegedly followed these instructions. Between 2006 and 2008, according to federal prosecutors, Nathan traveled to foreign cities including Mexico City, Lima, Peru, and Nicosia, Cyprus, where he met with Russian intelligence officers. At these meetings, he passed messages from his father and received cash payments that totaled approximately $47,000. The money was allegedly deposited into bank accounts that Harold Nicholson could eventually access upon his release from prison. The discovery of this ongoing espionage operation led to Nathan Nicholson's arrest in December 2008. He was charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General. Harold Nicholson, already serving his sentence for the original espionage, was charged with additional crimes related to the new conspiracy. The revelation that Nicholson had not only failed to reform during his imprisonment, but had actually recruited his own son into espionage activities, represented a new dimension of betrayal. Nathan Nicholson's case raised profound questions about culpability and victimization. He had been 13 years old when his father was arrested. He had grown up visiting his father in prison, receiving letters filled with declarations of love and regret. And then, as a young adult, he had been recruited by his father into criminal activity. Was he a willing co-conspirator, or was he a victim of parental manipulation? The legal proceedings against Nathan Nicholson unfolded in 2009. Unlike his father, who had fought the charges initially before eventually pleading guilty, Nathan cooperated with investigators from the beginning. He provided detailed statements about his father's instructions, his meetings with Russian intelligence officers, and the money he had received and transmitted. In January 2009, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government and conspiracy to commit money laundering At his sentencing hearing in June 2009, Nathan, Nicholson's attorney, argued for leniency, emphasizing that he had been manipulated by his father and had committed these crimes out of misplaced loyalty rather than greed or ideology. Character witnesses testified to Nathan's good character prior to his involvement in his father's espionage activities, and Nathan himself made a statement to the court expressing remorse and acknowledging that he had made terrible choices. The judge in the case, U.S. District Judge Liam O'Grady, acknowledged the complexity of Nathan's situation, but emphasized that he had made conscious choices as an adult to engage in illegal activities. The sentence imposed was 5 years of probation with 8 months to be served in home detention, a relatively lenient outcome that reflected both his cooperation and the mitigating circumstances of his recruitment by his father. Nathan was also ordered to forfeit the money he had received from the Russian intelligence officers. Harold Nicholson faced additional time for his role in the new conspiracy. In December 2010, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government. The additional sentence imposed was 8 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively to his original sentence. This meant that instead of being released in his mid-60s as he had anticipated, Nicholson would now serve time well into his 70s. The broader damage assessment of Nicholson's espionage continued for years after his conviction. The CIA conducted extensive reviews of operations that might have been compromised. Officers whose identities he had exposed were reassigned, retrained, or in some cases removed from operational roles if their compromise made them ineffective. Liaison relationships with foreign intelligence services were reviewed and, in some cases, restructured. The financial cost of Nicholson's betrayal was substantial but difficult to precisely calculate. Beyond the direct payment he received from Russian intelligence, there were the costs of the investigation, the security reviews, the operational changes required to mitigate the damage he caused, and the lost intelligence collection opportunities. Some estimates placed the total cost in the tens of millions of dollars. The human cost extended to the CIA officers whose careers and safety were compromised. While no CIA officer was known to have been killed as a direct result of Nicholson's betrayal, numerous officers faced the knowledge that their identities and training had been exposed. Some chose to leave the agency rather than serve in positions where they were known to hostile intelligence services. Others continued their careers, but with the constant awareness that they were compromised. Harold James Nicholson was ultimately released from federal prison on January 20, 2023, having served more than 20 years for his crimes. The terms of his release included restrictive conditions, supervised probation, limitations on his ability to travel, and prohibitions on contact with foreign nationals without approval. He returned to the Pacific Northwest, to an area near where he had grown up, to live out whatever years remained to him. His children, now adults with their own families, faced the ongoing challenge of reconciling their relationship with a father who had not only betrayed his country, but had also recruited one of them into espionage and destroyed the family structure they had known. Jeremy and Star Nicholson, the younger children who had been 11 and 8 when their father was arrested, had grown to adulthood with the legacy of his actions shaping their identities. Nathan, who served his sentence and attempted to rebuild his life, carried the additional burden of his own criminal conviction alongside the trauma of his father's manipulation. The case of Harold James Nicholson stands as one of the most significant espionage cases in post-Cold War American intelligence history, not because of any single, devastating operational compromise, but because of what it revealed about the persistent vulnerability of intelligence organizations to insider threats, and because of the layered human tragedy it represented. From one perspective, Nicholson's story is a straightforward case of betrayal motivated by financial greed. He was not driven by ideology or coercion. He was not a dissident who disagreed with American foreign policy. He was not someone who was blackmailed or manipulated. He was a middle-ranking professional who felt undervalued and underpaid, who believed he deserved more than he was receiving, and who made a calculated decision to sell his country's secrets for money. From another perspective, Nicholson's case illuminates the structural challenges that intelligence organizations face in identifying and preventing insider threats. Despite periodic polygraph examinations, despite financial monitoring, despite security awareness programs, Nicholson was able to conduct espionage activities for 2.5 years before being detected. And even after being imprisoned, he was able to use the prison correspondence system to continue espionage activities through his son. The question of what could have been done differently admits of no easy answers. The financial monitoring that eventually contributed to his detection was already in place. The polygraph examinations that showed anomalous results were conducted. The counterintelligence reviews that eventually identified the pattern of suspicious activities were operating as designed. But the nature of such systems is that they can only identify patterns after enough data points have accumulated, by which time damage has already occurred. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Nicholson's case is what it reveals about the potential for generational transmission of betrayal. Harold Nicholson did not only damage the CIA and compromise intelligence operations, he also recruited his own son into criminal activity, using parental authority and emotional manipulation to transform Nathan from a victim of his father's crimes into a participant in them. The fact that he did this from prison represents a form of betrayal that extends beyond the merely professional into the deeply personal. Nathan Nicholson's case poses difficult questions about responsibility and agency. He was an adult when he traveled to foreign cities to meet with Russian intelligence officers. He understood that what he was doing was illegal, but he was also someone who had been shaped by his father's imprisonment, who had grown up visiting his father in a federal penitentiary, who had received years of letters expressing regret and love and financial anxiety. When his father asked him for help, Nathan struggled to refuse. The Russian intelligence officers who recruited and handled Harold Nicholson remain anonymous and unpunished. They operated under diplomatic cover, protected by international norms, and were never publicly identified or held accountable. From the Russian perspective, Nicholson was a valuable source who provided useful information. When he was arrested, they simply moved on to cultivating other sources. The CIA officers whose identities and training Nicholson compromised went on with their careers to the extent possible, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been betrayed by someone who was supposed to be protecting them. Some achieved distinguished careers despite this compromise. Others found their effectiveness limited by their exposure and chose different paths. All of them had to reconcile themselves to the reality that in the intelligence profession, betrayal is always a possibility. The damage that Harold Nicholson caused to American intelligence operations cannot be fully measured. The specific operations that were compromised, the sources whose safety was jeopardized, the capabilities that were revealed, much of this information remains classified. What can be said with certainty is that his betrayal required extensive and expensive remediation efforts, that it compromised the safety and effectiveness of numerous CIA officers, and that it provided Russian intelligence with insights into American intelligence methods and priorities. But beyond the operational damage, Nicholson's case represents a human catastrophe that rippled outward from his initial decision. His wife lost her marriage and her career. His children lost their father and their sense of security. Nathan lost years of his young adulthood to criminal activity and its consequences. The CIA officers he trained and then betrayed lost the protection that should have been theirs. And Nicholson himself lost decades of his life to imprisonment, his reputation, his career, and ultimately any claim to honor. The question of whether Harold Nicholson feels genuine remorse remains unresolved. In his statements to the court, in his letters to his children, he has expressed regret and acknowledged the harm he caused. But he also continued his espionage activities from prison, recruiting his own son. These actions suggest that whatever remorse he expressed was either insincere or insufficient to prevent him from continuing to cause harm. There is no redemptive arc to Harold Nicholson's story, no moment of genuine transformation. He betrayed his country for money, was caught and imprisoned, and then betrayed his son by recruiting him into the same criminal activity. He served his sentence and was released, an elderly man diminished by age and imprisonment. His children must carry forward the knowledge of what their father did. The CIA officers he compromised must carry forward the knowledge that someone they trusted destroyed that trust for personal gain. The lessons from Nicholson's case continue to inform counterintelligence training and security procedures within the American intelligence community. His case is studied as an example of how insider threats develop, how they can be detected, and what damage they can cause. New security measures implemented in the wake of his arrest represent attempts to prevent future cases like his. Whether these measures are sufficient is unknowable until the next betrayal occurs. Harold James Nicholson was 44 years old when he first approached Russian intelligence officers and offered to sell his country's secrets. He was 46 when he was arrested. He was 72 when he was finally released from prison, having spent more than a quarter century in federal custody for crimes that took 2.5 years to commit. And in between, he compromised more than 100 CIA officers, destroyed his family, recruited his own son into crime, and demonstrated that even extensive training, periodic security reviews, and decades of service provide no guarantee against betrayal when someone decides that personal financial gain is worth any cost. The Russian intelligence officers who paid him returned to Moscow and likely received commendations. The CIA rebuilt its compromised operations and retrained its exposed officers. The American intelligence community implemented new security measures and continued its work. And the Nicholson family continued their lives, carrying forward the burden of a father and husband who chose money over loyalty, who chose betrayal over honor, and who chose himself over everyone who trusted him.